Okay, so if we look at this first one, how did Della get the money and how does she feel about it? So we had to go back up into this text and look at this line. Penny saved 1 and 2 at a time by bulldozing the grocer and the vegetable man and the butcher until one's cheeks burned with the silent imputation of parsimony that such close dealing implied. So we can tell if we break this down. Okay, first of all, she saves a little bit at a time. We know that she has some dealings with the grocer and the vegetable man, so we can tell she's buying things and she has to kind of run them over. So if I'm picturing this, I'm picturing her like haggling with them, trying to get their prices down. And it said her cheeks are burning. So I know that happens when we're embarrassed, so it must embarrass her. If we look at the definition here of parsimony, it's the quality of being careful with money or resources or being stingy. So I'm guessing the connotation here is somewhat negative. So she's feeling like people are thinking that she is, stingy, miserly, a cheapskate. And so she has to haggle to get the prices down, to save up money. And how does she feel about it? Well, she feels embarrassed. But she clearly feels that it's very important and necessary and worth the embarrassment. So what's the effect of starting the story with 3 short fragments? So we have the $1.87. That was all. And 60 cents of it was in pennies. So we have these short phrases here. We have to ask ourselves, why would he construct his sentences this way and why would he start this way? And it's really kind of effective because it piques our curiosity, first of all. I mean, it's a really interesting way to start. So we instantly want to know why we're hearing about this small monetary amount, and to hear that it's much of it is in pennies definitely gets across the fact that the person we're dealing with is poor, is in poverty. We find that their lack of money seems to be the source of conflict in the story, since they both want to buy one another nice Christmas gifts, but they can't really afford them. So the 3 short phrases call attention to that fact, because it really is the crux of the problem, and it's really what drives the plot the entire time. So imputation means subtle accusation. So, and I kind of already discussed this earlier, the effect of the words bulldozing, burned, parsimony on our understanding of her character. So we've already broken down that section, but what does it tell us about her? Well, it tells us that she doesn't like to be pushy. She doesn't like to haggle. She doesn't like to seem like she's cheap or stingy. But we learn that she can be forceful when she has to, that she can overcome her normal inclinations if it is a matter of doing something for Jim. But we can tell that she's embarrassed by her poverty as well. But Jim really is just that important to her. His needs or wants come above her pride. So why might the author have waited until the last word of paragraph 1 to mention Christmas? So we learn about her poverty and how she tries to save money. And then this paragraph ends with, and the next day would be Christmas. And to me, it's kind of piling it on. We're already sympathetic to her as we see how she tries so hard to save that little bit of money. And then when you add on top of it that it's Christmas, that's just, like I said, piling it on. It makes that impact greater. Instead of getting it all at once and feeling sympathetic and sad for her, we're already feeling sad for her. And now we have this additional moment of sympathy. So the author allows the reader to first feel for her impoverished state and then makes him or her feel the gravity of being poor at Christmas time separately, heightening the intensity of the reader's sympathy and of the conflict. How does the last sentence of paragraph 2 establish the theme of the story? So this kind of helps to establish that life can be difficult. It can be happy. The smiles signify that. But it's also full of hardships, and the sniffles represent that. So this is really showing how we can't necessarily control the circumstances and the hardships in our lives, but we control how we respond to them. Our responses to those hardships make us who we are. And so when you look at the story overall, they use their love to overcome the sniffles and sobs. They get their smiles from the love of one another, and it allows them to overcome. So when we look at the second section, we look at how their home is described. So we have this sentence here. It did not exactly beg your description, but it certainly had the word on the lookout for the mendicancy squad. And so this is basically kind of saying, well, it's kind of hard to put into words, but it certainly had that word on the lookout for the mendicancy squad. And if you look this up, this is the condition of being a beggar. So we have kind of that double meaning of beggar here. A mendicancy squad would go out and find beggars and prosecute them or chase them off. And so this is basically saying that this little flat is barely better than a place where a beggar might live. It's kind of making fun of their poverty, in describing their flat. And then it goes on to say that their letterbox was broken, no letter would go in it, and their doorbell, or the little button that they would press to make noise to unlock the door, to alert them that someone's at the door, no mortal finger could coax a ring from it, so it's broken as well. So it's not very nice. The doorbell doesn't work. The mail slot's broken. It looks like a place just above where beggars might live. How does the description reinforce what you understood from the opening paragraphs? What has happened to Della and her husband? So if we go and look in this paragraph, we find that he was formerly paid $30 a week. Now he's paid $20. A $10 difference would be a very, very significant sum. And so because his pay is cut, we find out that's why they're struggling so much financially. So for number 8, if you look up beggar, which you probably didn't need to, beggar is someone who is poor, who is asking for handouts, for resources to be given. This person is begging for resources, food, or money. And we already talked about mendicancy, which if you click on it, it'll take you right to the definition, condition of being a beggar, practice of begging. So how does this wordplay reinforce the description of the apartment? So to beg or description just means that we're kind of like begging for words. We can't really put the description into words, but there's a reason that he used beggar, because obviously it has that double meaning. And so he includes that within the mendicancy squad because the word beggar is associated with being poor, so poor that one must beg for resources. The mendicancy squad look to arrest poor people or beggars or to chase them off. And so, again, this is just establishing how poor they are, as if we didn't already know. Definitely helps to develop it further. What might be significant that the change in their income is discussed in terms of the use of full name or initial. So, and I think it's kind of sad when we look at this section. O. Henry's making a joke here, but it's still significant. It said, now when the income was shrunk to $20, though, they were thinking seriously of contracting to a modest and unassuming D. But whenever Mr. James Dillingham Young came home and reached his flat above, he was called Jim and greatly hugged by Mrs. James Dillingham Young, already introduced to you as Della, which is all very good. Well, what we were referring to, if you look earlier in the text, this was referring to the little card that was above the button that you would ring to alert the inhabitants of the flat that someone was visiting and needed the door open. So on that little card, it says Mr. James Dillingham Young, but when he gets that reduction in salary, they joke about just changing it to D instead of his full name. And sadly, I think that indicates that Jim feels like less of a person because he makes less money. Maybe he feels less important. Maybe the couple, they feel less important or valued. However, it's clear that when they're together, Della loves him and he is his real Jim self. So money doesn't affect who he is in her eyes. That's why I think Henry was sure to include this line. He was called Jim and greatly hugged when he came home. So how does their class or financial situation contribute to the story's plot and themes? Well, their poverty drives the conflict and all of their attempts to solve the problem. It drives the plot, and it's also the strife that their love must overcome. In this last section, we have the question, why does buying the right present for Jim seem important to Della? And so if we look at this section, per Jim, many a happy hour she had spent planning for something nice for him, something fine and rare and sterling, something just a little bit near to being worthy of the honor of being owned by Jim. So you can see how highly she regards him, how valuable he is to her. She loves him so dearly that she feels that he deserves something truly special, something just a little bit near to being worthy of the honor of being owned by Jim. So what does Della realize when she sees herself in the mirror? So this is kind of just a simple inference we would make. So she's looking in this kind of mirrored glass where she can kind of see herself if she stands just right. And you can tell as her eyes shine brightly, you can tell she has kind of an aha moment, and her face loses her color because this idea comes to her. But I think this is also something that she doesn't necessarily want to do. This is going to be a great sacrifice. But she pulls down her hair, and that's when she realizes she could sell her hair. What possessions do they value? One was Jim's gold watch that had been his father's and his grandfather's. The other was Della's hair. Had the Queen of Sheba lived in the flat across the air shaft, Della would have let her hair hang out the window some day to dry, just to depreciate Her Majesty's jewels and gifts. Had King Solomon been the janitor with all his treasures piled up in the basement, Jim would have pulled out his watch every time he passed, just to see him pluck at his beard from envy. Again, this is O. Henry showing a sense of humor. I mean, clearly that's, gross exaggeration. It's very, very untrue. They're very poor by contrast. What they have is very meager. So it shows that their values, the values of their possessions, they're not much at all. But to Della and Jim, those items are very, very valuable. But it also inserts some humor and just points out how truly poor they are. That what's most, that's what they have that's of most value when you compare it to what, the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon have, what's of most value to them. You can see the huge discrepancy. Knowing what you know about the story's conclusion, what do the details in this section contribute to the narrator's view of the couple as both foolish and wise? Well, they're foolish to place so much emphasis on these possessions and also to trade them away. They're also so very wise to value each other so highly. That's where the true wisdom comes from. And so the possessions mean nothing in light of that. They're much wiser than they are foolish. So just to take a moment to kind of talk about the Magi, because that's where this whole idea of being wise comes from. That's an allusion to a biblical story where there are 3 Magi that follow a star to Bethlehem so they can give gifts to the baby Jesus in the story, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Even though these gifts are intended for a very important individual, the gifts are actually very ordinary in nature because their value was spiritual. It was not about material worth. Gold's a symbol of earthly kingship. Frankincense is an incense. It's a symbol of godliness. Myrrh is an embalming oil, a symbol of death. So these gifts were given in recognition of Jesus' importance in the Christian story, in the biblical story. So in the gift, so it's clearly a reference. So in the gift of the Magi, The Magi symbolize wisdom. So the narrator admonishes Della and Jim as two foolish children in a flat who most unwisely sacrificed for each other the greatest treasures of their house, but then admits that they are the wisest. So the allusion to the Magi in O. Henry's title suggests that Della's and Jim's sacrificial gifts transcend material value as well. They reinforce the spiritual value of their love for one another. Such working class people may lack physical possessions, but they do not necessarily lack spiritual values. Common, everyday people, such as the young couple in the story, can be as wise as the Magi.